evening, everybody. Little closer. Hi, good evening, everybody. It's 3:53. Few minutes late, but some of our first-year students were finishing their presentations of their field visit, so we wanted to give them a few minutes to finish that and come. I guess over the next few minutes they'll come, but will not hold up this any further. I have great pleasure in welcoming Mr. A.V. Balasubramaniam, the director of CISK, to our university. Balu to friends. It's my friend because Vijay Padki introduced him to me some time back. And many of you know that Vijay Padki came and gave his colloquium 2 weeks ago. And we are all in the same space. And when Vijay said, "What about Balu?" I just grabbed this opportunity with both hands. I requested Balu, "Will you come here?" And Balu said, "The earliest I can come here is on the 29th of August. So I said, "No, our orientation is in progress. There are all of new students coming in here. It will be a wonderful occasion if you can please coincide your colloquium with our orientation program." Balu, in fact, has taken a day off, an annual meeting that is happening in Chennai perhaps, and taken a train this morning to come here and will go back by tonight's train. The Center for Indian Knowledge Systems is already well known and does a lot of work in its own tremendous way. I know that if I say sustainable agriculture, it is in a very, very telegraphic language and a very inadequate way of saying what they do. They do a lot of work with that. They connect with experiments on the ground. They try to see what they could do with school curriculum. They've in fact done bio gardens in schools. They produced a manual based on that, and they connect back again with what they could do with higher education and with schools. So there's a lot of work that's happening, and Balu's at the vanguard of it all. He has some time with us, and I will not take much of that time. All I'll say is it's a great pleasure and privilege to have you here with us, Balu, and the stage is yours.
And I'm delighted to be here for more than one reason. The first is that though for over 30 years I've been in what can be called as a non-profit sector, I originated in the university, and myself and my wife always say that while we love our jobs, one thing we really miss is the interaction with students. Every year the challenge that we face, sometimes they lived with the subject for 20 years and you think you know it in and out. Then someone right out of high school throws a question at you, and then you are floored and you think, why didn't I think of it that way, or why didn't I think of it at all, So it's always a delight to be back at the university. The second thing is, of course, Bangalore is like a second home for me. I grew up partly in Cambridge Layout and Alsur. I don't know if I'm pointing in the right direction. Today's Bangalore is disorienting to me. I studied for 5 years in Central College and then in Tata Institute, Indian Institute of Science, which still to us is Tata Institute. So it's always nice to be back. Thank you. So I want to share some thoughts on this broad topic of, is there an Indian way of doing sciences? The inspiration for this title comes from a very interesting essay that was written by this great poet and literary figure, A.K. Ramanujam. In 1980s, he wrote an interesting essay called, "Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?" And in that essay, he said that, is there an Indian way of thinking is really a meta question that includes within it 4 questions, sub-questions. First of all, you can say, is there an Indian way of thinking? By that you mean, is there something today as against what was there in the past? Or you can say, is there an Indian way of thinking, one single Indian way? Or there are many ways, there are the ways of the tribal people, the non-tribal people, the hilly people, the plains, the people belong to various communities. Or is there an Indian way of thinking, by which you mean as against a Greek way or a Roman way or whatnot? And is there an Indian way of thinking or doing various other things? In a sense, it's a takeoff from that, trying to pose this question, is there an Indian way of doing science? Till about 29, 30 years back, I was in a university system in many places, and sometimes I used to face this question after I returned to India from my student days in US, whenever I said I'm doing something about Indian knowledge systems, I used to get some various types of reactions, some of it puzzled, some of it hostile and annoyed, saying that, look, I don't know what all these Indian knowledge systems are. Sometimes I look at Greek texts that are 2000 years old like Euclid. It seems to me that it's still science, it's not rubbish. You are showing me some text, it looks like all kinds of mixed up stuff. What is this Indian knowledge system that you're talking about? So in a sense, it's a question that I try to answer for myself. What is there an Indian way of doing science? But first, let me try to ask what's the purpose of such an inquiry? Because working scientists are often very skeptical about these philosophical inquiries. Richard Feynman once made this statement that philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. According to some other people, this statement is attributed to Steven Weinberg. So first, as they say in India, what is the prayojanam, what is the utility of such an inquiry? Why am I asking a question like this? I would say these are the reasons that lead me to this question. First of all, I think that let's have an understanding of the cultural, geographic and civilizational specificities of knowledge. I have also been brought up on a diet of modern university education in Bangalore University, Indian Institute of Science, universities in US, CSIR labs and all that, where we think that science is a single monolithic thing. It has no cultural, geographical or civilizational specificities. I'd like to claim that it indeed has. Can we comprehend that or address that? A better understanding and utilization of traditional Indian knowledge. Unless we have some idea as to what is the nature of these traditional knowledge systems, we may not be able to grasp or utilize this. As a protection against what I call as epistemic fascism, that's too much jargon. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge and nature of knowledge. And anybody who would claim that there is only one type of knowledge or one nature of knowledge, they may fall into the trap of being fascists in the area of epistemology, so to protect. And lastly, I would say that quite often we find that there are many working scientists, to the great exasperation of some modern scientists and to the great delight of some others, they seem to be having split personalities, They have certain behavioral patterns coming from their scientific training. Like several years back, I used to work with Dr. Bhargava in CCMB. CCMB had not yet been formed. He used to look at me and talk in exasperation about you people. By you people, he meant Tamil Brahmin community. That Monday to Friday, you may be doing cosmology and theoretical physics, calculate the diameter of the universe and whatnot. On Saturday and Sunday, your wife says that it's a new moon day, you go to take a dip in the, and then you do this and that because there's some story about Rahu that is swallowing the moon. What is all this type of thing? There is such a split because it looks like some part of our personality is derived from certain kind of training. Other parts of our personality is still from a cultural baggage or background. Is it possible to do something to bridge this divide? One of the more modest questions I'd like to pose is, what is the nature of traditional knowledge? How does it differ from modern knowledge? And are there any distinct specific features that it has? I think it's too large an agenda or presumptuous to think that all this can be answered and wrapped up in 45 minutes that Giridhar has given me. But I thought that we'll make an opening, just pose a few questions and try to get a glimpse of some of the thinking in this area. I'd like to talk, when I talk about why am I comparing modern science or modern knowledge with traditional, almost all of us, barring very few, have been brought up on a diet of a modern university education, which means the science and technology that we have imbibed or learned is from a modern Western scientific tradition. As a counterpost, if I were to say that, is there any other kind of knowledge that exists or you're talking about, let me start with a few questions like, one is the social organization of knowledge, and secondly, some features of scientific method and approach. Can we focus on some of these to get a flavor of what these differences are? So first of all, if I take as an illustration an area of traditional knowledge like traditional medicine, one of the interesting features that I find in traditional medicine, which is shared with many other branches of knowledge, is what I call as a social organization of knowledge. In almost all areas of this knowledge, you have what you may call as a Lok Parampara, which is a folk stream of knowledge, and another a Shastriya Parampara or a classical or a formalized stream of knowledge. I'd like to illustrate what I mean by this. First of all, in the area of medicine, if you are talking about classical knowledge, there are institutionally trained practitioners of Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani and all that. There is a well developed and clearly spelt out theory of medical science. It has a terminology, it has jargon, it has theories. There are a large number of texts and manuscripts that support, characterize and describe all this. So, this is some features of this Shastriya Parampara. And running parallel to this, there is a folk tradition or what you may call as a Lok Parampara. There are folk and tribal practitioners all over India, they may be called as Vaidus or Vaidyas or Bhagats. There are families specializing in the treatment of specific diseases, They may be like jaundice or they may be like asthma. There is household knowledge of simple remedies for common ailments, proverbs and folk sayings related to health. There are preventive and promotive methods like yoga or martial arts, the Kalari of Kerala. There are specialty areas where you have practitioners like bone setters. And then there are traditional birth attendants or dais. What's common to all this is that none of these are people who are institutionally trained or taking degrees, nor do they have an elaborate theoretical framework or manuscripts or text to support all this. It's like a Guru Parampara type of thing that goes on. Now, what is very interesting if you look at these two paramparas or these two strands is that there is a commonality of underlying theory and worldview. This is something which I looked at in detail. Underlying practices of an Ayurvedic practitioner as well as a folk practitioner, there are common threads like, for example, the Panchamahabhut Siddhanta Tridosha theory. The idea that disease is something that's caused by loss of balance between these three biological principles, Vata, Pitta and Kapha. An Ayurvedic practitioner may know it at a certain level of refinement and rigor of theory, whereas my mother, who is not an Ayurvedic practitioner, she is 82 years old, she studied up to 8th standard, will tell me not to drink when I was leaving home this morning, so early in the morning, very much like kapi kudicha, pittam, etc. She knows it as part of the parampara, not because she went to any school, this is the type of thing. There is a commonality of technical terms like Vata, Pitta, Kapha, Ushna. There is also at a more technical level commonality of pramana or means for validation, like pratyaksha, anumana, etc. And most interestingly, the classical texts themselves have a theoretical framework where they have a view that this Lok Parampara or the people's tradition is part of this framework of knowledge. A classical text of Ayurveda like Charaka Samhita, Charaka Samhita just means the compilation of Rishi Charaka, has very many interesting verses like this one which says, Aushadhi Nama Rupabhyam, the goatherds, shepherds, cowherds and other forest dwellers, they are the people who know the drugs by name and form, and these are the people from whom you can gather knowledge. Even within the theoretical framework of the Shastra, there is room for and a relationship to this folk knowledge that you see. Coming down to, okay, all this is stuff about Charaka Samhita thousands of years back, what do you see today? I'll just give you a glimpse of it. In 1980s, the Department of Environment launched what they call as an All India Coordinated Research Program on Ethnobiology, where they made a detailed survey of knowledge of plants and animals that's available with the tribal community that constitutes just about 7 to 8% of the population. They found that the tribal community has a knowledge of as many as 9,500 plants, of which one of the major use categories is medicinal, 7,500, and so many other things like this. In comparison, you find that the big three texts of Ayurveda make a mention and use of about 750 to 900 species of plants. There is rich knowledge regarding various aspects of medicine that is there with the folk community that is there. Another very interesting example we have looked at is, there are very many sectors like this where we find there is very rich folk knowledge. For example, traditional practices of agriculture. The Indian Council of Agricultural Research sometime made a detailed inventory of traditional practices relating to agriculture. Then they went on to do something even more interesting, validation of indigenous technical knowledge. They gave out some of these practices to Indian Council of Agriculture Research Lab, Krishi Vigyan Kendras, agricultural universities, test it by modern scientific methods, tell us if it is valid or what you see in it. There are various validation So, sum and substance of it is, when we did a detailed analysis, out of 111 practices that were subject to testing and validation, as many as 95%, 95 of them as per ICAR scientists is valid, 3 of them are considered partly valid, 2 of them to be repeated, and 10 of them they say are not valid. This just shows the stupendous strength and vitality of traditional knowledge in an area like agriculture even today. Now, similar folk and classical tradition streams are something that you find in many sectors of Indian knowledge, not just medicine or agriculture, but grammar, arithmetic, language, music. Bharata's Natya Shastra talks about the Desi and the Marga. This type of thing runs through the entire gamut of our knowledge system. Very interestingly, for example, if you take a text of grammar like Panini's Ashtadhyayi, there is a detailed discussion about theories, how theories are formed. There is a very nice discourse where they talk about what is the role of the expert, what is the role of the common person. And in modern grammar, you have this discussion of whether grammar is something that's prescriptive or descriptive. There is a discussion here where in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, which is a great commentary on the Ashtadhyayi grammar, he says, he who has the use of a pot can go to a potter's house and say, make a pot, I have to use it. But no one similarly goes to the house of a grammarian and says, coin words, I wish to make use of them. Where do words get coined? It's during the course of vyavahar or discourse in the streets, in the marketplace, during the course of normal life type of thing. There are very many fascinating discussions in terms of the role of the expert and the role of the layperson. This is a thread that runs through all aspects of our learning. Now, I'd like to go on to some other features of traditional scientific knowledge to help us to appreciate how this is different from what we are talking about as modern scientific knowledge. Partly because many of us, when we look at traditional knowledge, we have gathered a checklist of ideas, either explicitly or implicitly. We run it through the knowledge and see does it measure up or not, and sometimes we have to look at it from a different standpoint. Now, in the West, if you ask, what is the paradigm example of a supreme theory, people would usually cite the elements of Euclid is considered a paradigm example for completely worked out scientific theory, a set of axioms, a set of theorems from which the entire framework can be derived. Similarly, in India, such a status has been assigned not so much to mathematics or any physical science, but to language, to grammar itself. Panini's Ashtadhyayi is considered as a paradigm example of what is a perfectly worked out theory, with the result that in the West, if you want to have any scientific discourse, description, measurement, you feel that to attain rigor, you have to have measurements, accuracy, counting in numbers. The traditional Indian approach seems to be that the normal language, which is Prakrit, may have a lot of fussiness about it, lot of richness and variations, whereas you can subject normal language to refinement and come up with a Sanskrit. Sanskrit just means refined, that's all, And in the language of Sanskrit, you can have highly abstruse philosophical ideas, quantitative ideas discussed. There is a strong difference in streak in this. So, measurement and quantification are required, given a lot of importance, whereas language and refinement of language, use of natural language itself is highly developed in India, even in highly technical discourses. One other aspect which I want to spend a few minutes on to discourse is that we are often very puzzled and disturbed by the fact that there are many Indian scientific theories which we think seem to be timeless. We seem to think that they are fossilized, they are not changing with time. Does it mean that they are not advanced? Because 50 years back you had some medical theories, today you have some new thing, new causation of disease. I want to draw this example from a very interesting treatise. In pre-independence India, the British government appointed a committee to go into the nature of Indian systems of medicine. Do they have a scientific basis and all that? There was a very interesting doctor, medical doctor, Captain Srinivasa Murthy, who was a secretary to this committee that is called the Usman Committee. He interviewed hundreds of Ayurvedic Vaidyas, Siddha, Unani physicians, and he wrote a treatise called The Scientific Basis of Indian Systems of Medicine. where as a modern medical man, he tried to reflect on what are these different theories that people are talking about. No? There is a very interesting illustration that he gave, which I have rendered into a cartoon. Normally, if you ask a modern physician to diagnose a particular disease, he may say that the causative agent may be a virus or it may be a bacterium. It may be some new thing that we didn't even know about 50 years back. There may be a Japanese encephalitis or there may be a SARS virus and all that. Ayurvedic physicians are using a framework where they say that we are diagnosing diseases imbalance of Vata, Pitta or Kapha. What is very disturbing to a modern scientific mind like me is the apparent timelessness of this. This seems to be fossilized and not evolved for so long. Don't you have any latest thing, man? Are you talking about the same thing for 25 centuries? He addresses this in a very interesting way. He says that, look, we have to comprehend that different scientific disciplines may be using different kinds of categories to make their theory. And he gave this excellent example, a very illuminating example. He said, suppose you make a list of all the people who tried to conquer or invade India over the last 20, 30 centuries. One is you can make a list saying that the Greeks came, or the Arabs came, or then the Turks came, or someone else came, and in future years there may be other people who will come along. The other way is that you don't make a list of that kind. You say, let's classify them as those who came by water, those who came by air, and those who came by on the ground. Now, this is a very different kind of a category in philosophical terms. In terms of the jargon of philosophy, there are some schemes of classification that will exhaust the universe of discourse. Not only any conquest that was in the past or today, in the future, it has to be one of these three or a combination. So he says the way in which the Ayurvedic physicians, traditional medicine is approaching is, look at the symptom complex. Anybody who is ill or having some symptoms, he is presenting himself with some symptoms. You classify it in a different kind of a category, saying that certain things show derangement of Vata or Pitta or Kapha, and that schema is universal in the sense that it not only accommodates whatever you have seen in the past, but it makes room that you can classify, accommodate. No? So this is a different way of addressing things or a scheme of addressing things. And this is something which is very dramatically illustrated. We had this example of a very famous Ayurvedic physician in Pune called Vaidya Bapu Nanal, BP Nanal. I had interviewed him once in the 80s. It was an interesting interview. They said that there was a patient who was discharged from Tata Memorial Hospital cancer saying that this is an incurable case of blood cancer, you try to manage. He came to BP Nanal, and after 3 years that person said that he is fine and he was continuing in good health. He recovered 50% of his normal activities. So some of us interviewed BP Nanal and say, can we now say that you can treat blood cancer? He says, look, I don't know or understand this terminology of blood cancer. This patient presented himself before me. He was carrying records from some institute saying that it is blood cancer, but those are not the categories in which I think or analyze. I put that aside and examined him. According to me, he is suffering from Asti Majjagavat or Tivra Dhatu Kshay. Okay? Asti Dhatu and Majja Dhatu is affected by Vata and a severe depletion of Dhatus. I know the line of treatment for that. I have treated him. He is recovered. I wouldn't say he is cured. If he takes some medication, observes some precautions, there is no reason why he could live on healthily for several more years. So this is not just a text of the past or fiction. It's possible to use different kind of categories too. I am just dwelling on this point because quite often we feel that something that is scientific, something that's rational, something that should sensible, should keep on changing. In fact, there are some Ayurvedic physicians who even contemptuously told me that, what do you think of our theories? Do you think they are like fashions and clothes that they have to change every 5 to 10 years? You want to attain good health. You want me to treat disease. You want me to deliver good health. You please measure me by those yardsticks. You produce the patient before me, or you tell me which is the community which has to be maintained in good health, and I will do it according to my theories, show what can be delivered. So I gave this example to say that traditional knowledge systems may be using different kinds of categories and approaches in their treatment. So some of the other features are in terms of measurement and quantification. Traditional sciences may be often using quantification and measurement procedures that are different from modern science in the sense that they are usually normalized to the individual. When you say that something is 1.00678 meters or something, effectively it means that it is 1.0078 or something times a standard meter. What is the standard meter? Today we are talking about it in terms of the wavelength of some cesium or something, but till a few years back it was a distance between two scratches in a platinum iridium bar, that is the International Standards Bureau of Standards in Paris. That's all it means. Whereas if you say that somebody's height is so many angulars, or somebody's volume of urine is so many times one's anjali, this is also a quantitative measurement, but the volume that you take as standard is normalized to the situation or individuals. You know, they are talking about different types of standards or in terms of constructing theories, this is like an assortment of certain qualities that I have seen in terms of traditional knowledge, which I am trying to share with you. Very often you will find that there is a unified approach to human, animal and plant life. They are often using categories like smell and taste. Now this is something which is quite alarming to a modern trained chemist or biochemist like me, because the moment somebody says that something has some property because it smells like this or tastes like this, I feel that ye to bakwas hai, you know. But then I had to contend that feeling, and I want to share with you what I came up with. You know. About 15-20 years back, we worked mainly on sustainable agriculture. We started looking at Vriksha Ayurveda, just as there is Ayurveda, which is the science of health for human beings. There is branches of Ayurveda which are called as Vriksha Ayurveda that talks about health and disease of plants, and Mriga Ayurveda that talks about animals. We were trying to look at texts of Ayurveda to see how they look at plants and health and disease. And we came up with some interesting example. My colleague and wife, Vijayalakshmi, who also works with me in Vriksha Ayurveda, she recalled an incident from childhood that in their home garden, they used to maintain a garden, and their one season they found that they used to normally have an excellent yield of this Pushnika, Benincasa, etc., this ash gourd. One season they found that there were profusion of flowers, but the flowers were shedding, not maturing to fruits. So then they asked an old gardener around, what can we do? He said, no, don't worry about it. You just take a small piece of peringayam, hing, You dig up near the root, cut that root and you put it, theek ho jayega type. They did that, and they found that that year they had a bumper crop. Now 20 years later, as people are looking more formally at Indian knowledge systems, Vriksha Ayurveda, we are trying to understand the rationale of it, working with Ayurvedic physicians. What they are saying is that the transformation of a fruit to a flower is governed by a proper regulation and functioning of Vata, and more importantly, Ayurvedic texts have classifications of therapeutic properties of materials, where they have classified materials into various kinds of ganas. For example, there is a gana called Jwaragna Gana, which means all the herbs under that category can be used for treatment and control of jwara, that is fevers. There is a gana that is called as Garbhasthapaka and Garbhaposhaka, which means it helps to establish the fetus and helps to nourish the fetus. There are some cases where women, or even some families, there may be habitual abortions, or there may be a lot of abortions. There are some yogas and herbs that they use for establishing the fetus and nourishing the fetus. Hing and some of these herbs that are used to do this, across the spectrum they say they would work in a similar way at a fundamental level for plants, for animals as well as for humans. They are talking about this entire properties and therapeutics at a very different level. And it's important to us because we have been able to use it practically, working with the farming community to increase the yield of various crops. Now, similarly, we have been also doing research on the use of various plants for pest control and crop protection. And here we came across extremely challenging and interesting kind of a situation. Lots of plants farmers use for pest control and crop protection. If you ask why do you use this particular plant or why do you use that particular plant, if you make a collection of farmers' logic, they would say things like, for controlling pests, we can use plants that are extremely bitter in taste, or we can use plants that have a strong odor or flavor. No? It can be positive or negative, badbu or khushbu, whatever it is. We can use plants that are not grazed by goats. We can use plants which have a property that if you break the stem or the leaf, there will be a milky secretion, like with Arca, Calotropis. Now, is there a theoretical foundation or basis for it? Ayurveda strongly says that there is a relationship between nutritional and therapeutic properties and taste. A balanced food in a modern sense is balanced in the sense that it should have so much of vitamin, so much of protein, so much of carbohydrate. But traditionally, a balanced food would also say, Bhojanam Shadrasopetam, they say. The 6 rasas, the 6 tastes must also be in balance. But this idea that there can be some particular property that flows out of just taste is something quite novel to a modern trained chemist like me. So we tried to probe a bit into that. What is the origin of this? And we found that it's very interesting that there are problems that we are having with fruit and shoot borer of brinjal, which is not getting treated even with neem. So after all this discussion about Vriksha, some of my field staff said, why don't we try out Andrographis paniculata? That's called as Kalmeg in the north, Syria Nangai we call it. It has extremely bitter taste. They found that that is very effective in controlling this. I said, why did you try that? We asked ourselves what is more bitter than even neem. So we decided we have to probe a little bit into what is underlying this prejudice against taste. We have to go quite deep into the history and philosophy of modern Western thought and science, as it turns out. As early as Aristotle, he makes a classification. Aristotle says that there are some qualities that are trustworthy and some other qualities that are not trustworthy. This is quite a deep thing, and it's worth reflecting upon. He says, for example, that if you say that the color of that shirt is red, I cannot corroborate the redness of that shirt by smelling it or tasting it. If I say that the taste of the apple is sweet, I cannot corroborate the taste by looking at it or by feeling it. Whereas if I say that there are 3 chairs there, I can look at it that there are 3 chairs. I can even blindfold, feel and figure out there are 3 chairs. So he says there are some qualities which can be grasped through only one sense organ, like color, smell and taste. He says they are untrustworthy because we can't corroborate their correctness or otherwise by other means. There are other qualities like shape, size, number and all that which can corroborate. So this is fairly deep into the hardware of modern scientific thinking. And then he goes on to say, he uses the term essential sensibilia and symbiotic sensibilia. Essential sensibilia, if you can corroborate and get from more than one source, is more likely that it reflects the inherent quality of that material rather than it is just an artifact of our perception. And this went deeper. So the primary, and Galileo wrote a postscript to it much later. He says the primary qualities of objects can all be measured. Secondary qualities are not simply measurable. And secondary qualities cannot be determinably related to each other. This is the what Galileo went on to say. And then he came up with this interesting statement. There is more in common between the weight of an apple and the weight of the moon than between the weight of an apple and the color of an apple. Very fundamentally different kinds of qualities. Now then, what did the Indians think about it? Let's try to see. What did the Indian theoreticians make of this, or how did they approach this? If you look at a basic text like Padartha Dharma Sangraha, basic properties of matters in the Nyaya school, they admit that objects can be, there are some things that can be measured through more than one sense organ or sense. There are some that can be acquired through only one sense organ. There are also those that can be acquired only through the internal sense organ or manas. For example, Ichha or Dvesha, you feel desire or aversion to something. You don't necessarily have to see, it may just be a feeling. And then they went on to say that error and falsehood regarding knowledge of qualities is important. However, the truthfulness of knowledge is understood independently and not in relationship to the basic sensory mode of acquisition. You may acquire something through one or two or no sense organs, but that does not necessarily mean that what you acquire through two sense organs is necessarily true or not. You have to independently verify it. So, here I am just saying that we have a lead from traditional knowledge saying that something that tastes extremely bitter may have biopesticidal properties. We are not rejecting that as junk, saying that how can taste possibly have anything to do with it. We go on and test it, and we find that there are pests against which it is actually of use. I am running some of these examples through to say that sometimes when we look at traditional knowledge, if you look at the text and say that something that tastes like this would be like this, something that smells like this would be like this, our natural aversion would be to just reject it as some mumbo jumbo, but we have to go quite deep into it and see that this is a very different basis to comprehending this knowledge. Okay. Now, what do I see as the problems and prospects in terms of utilization of traditional knowledge? I say there are problems at various levels and there are also signs of scope. I will spend the last 15-20 minutes going at it. So, in terms of dialogue between scientific traditions, there is a much older kind of style which I would say is like a colonial hangover, which is prospecting traditional knowledge. That is to say, you pick up bits and pieces of traditional knowledge, you try to validate it only with modern scientific knowledge, and whatever you think is validated, you can pick it up and incorporate in a modern scheme of things. That is a regular colonial style of doing science. And it is reflected, for example, the National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad, produces a magazine for nutrition education. There is a question that says, is lime hot or cold food? A reader asks. And their answer is, it's true that there is a widespread belief that some foods are hot and others are cold. However, there appears to be no scientific basis. There is a whole colossal literature of Ayurveda that talks about substances being Ushna or Shita and properties that derive from it. But a modern scientific knowledge shrugs at it and says that there is absolutely no basis to it. Now, we comprehend only that which has gone through the modern scientific grill. So, here is a cartoon I have just drawn often. There is a schoolgirl who missed her school bus, and so she told her dad, can you drive me to school? So, this is the path that she took him by, and when he went finally, he said that, but don't you know that there is a road like this? And she said she knew only this road because the school bus always took her in that route. So, it is a little bit of that when you are doing, when we say that we will comprehend knowledge only if it comes in a particular manner or in a particular way. There is also another thing that people are now, in terms of documenting utilization of traditional knowledge and all that, there seems to be a lot of fear over this whole thing of intellectual property rights. If we air it out too much, if we share this property too much, somebody will come and steal it from us, somebody is going to patent it. Some Tamil magazine published this very interesting cartoon showing Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Advani in very unusual costumes, and the translation for this reads that it has just come, we have just come to know yesterday that an American company has acquired the patent rights for our khadi kurta pajama. So, I think there is a bit of a hysteria around this. Personally, I am of the view that the great problem or tragedy is not so much that someone else is going to steal our knowledge, but we ourselves are not doing very much with it. That is the greater tragedy. We may say that Americans are trying to patent turmeric wound healing properties. CSIR, so many people fought a valiant battle. They have stopped that now. It sounds great. But then the more fundamental question is, if 30 centuries back, Indians knew that turmeric has wonderful wound healing properties, today we must be world leaders in the area of wound healing. And we must be doing unheard of things with wound healing that no one else in the world does. Are we doing anything with it? I don't think we are. Some Ayurvedic physicians are doing, but as a nation we are doing hardly anything with it. So, I think that the big tragedy is not so much that someone is going to come, grab, steal our knowledge. The tragedy is that we ourselves are not doing a whole lot with it. I think we should think more about that. Now, I also want to share with you a few things in terms of, I have been dwelling quite a bit also in terms of this mental cobwebs. Where do we get these ideas that science is like this, science is like that and all that. A lot of our notions regarding science, the value of science, traditionally what it is derived really from a system of education, records and thoughts that we have still inherited from the British colonial times. I want to cite a couple of very interesting examples written by one of the greatest thinkers of recent times, Dharampal, who opened the eyes of many of us to prospects and traditional Indian sciences and technologies, how we got this image of ourselves as being terribly backward in science and all that. There are 2-3 examples, but I'll just give you one example that's very interesting. Now, sometime in the 1794, Joseph Banks receives a letter from Helen. I'm sorry, I'll use this other example. No, I don't. Now, sometime in 1790, the British scholars who are trying to look at Indian records relating to astronomy knowledge systems, they are confronted with this very difficult problem. They find that Indian astronomical observations pertaining to the period 3102 BC onwards, that's traditionally the time when we say the Kali Yuga started, were correct by every conceivable test. Okay? So, they have a big dilemma now. If as early as 3100 the Indians knew about positions of Saturn, eclipses, that this, either they must have had powerful astronomical observatories that they actually saw it, or they must have been such good theoreticians that they calculated. No? Which of these could be true? No? So, this was really a dilemma. What is it that you think Indians are capable of? And there is a very interesting observation that they go on to say. Now, Playfair goes on to say that they must have had observatories that are so powerful that they actually saw it, because if that was not the case, we have to concede that these guys had a Newton, and how can there be a Newton among the Brahmins? That's what his language says. If they didn't have powerful observatories, they must have had a theoretician whose calculation was as powerful as Newton. Even at that time, they say that this is really not possible, that is really not possible. There are such strong messages and thoughts regarding traditional sciences and technologies that are coming down, and we have imbibed much of it during the course of our education or lack of education. No? Okay, I am just going to do a fast forward about some of this. What do I think of today's situation? I think there is a lot of interesting development and signs of hope. First of all, I think there is a slow resurgence of traditional knowledge. There is still a whole lot of vitality and vigor at the grassroots level. There are also signs of collaboration between traditions at and modernity at an operational level. No? I want to cite a very interesting example. This is a plant called Acacia auriculiformis. This is an exotic that was brought by the forest department for afforestation programs in various parts of Maharashtra. This is an exotic that came from Australia. It was observed that within 2 years of it being introduced in Maharashtra, in the Karjat tribal area, the local tribals are using the seeds of this plant as fish poison. It's one of the traditional tribal ways of fishing. Now, interestingly, there is no record of knowledge of the property of this being a fish poison either in modern scientific research or back home in Australia from where it originated. This means that the tribals have done extremely fast research, or whatever you call, in the 2 years that is there, that they have grasped, analyzed the properties of it, and they are practically using it. There are lots and lots of such examples. Because of lack of time, I am not going to go through it. There are other interesting efforts that are going on is at an operational level, people try to integrate inputs from modern science as well as traditional science. Several years back, I was also for some time a teacher in Krishnamacharya Yogamandiram at Chennai. There we find something very interesting, that for a certain disease like asthma or back pain, a very interesting integration is often happening at the level of the patients themselves. There are certain things for which they would analyze and understand that they would go for help to traditional medicine. There are certain other things for which they would want to come to modern medicine. However, this collaboration or integration was a little limited, because it's not as if the experts of the two areas sat together and decided to collaborate in the interest of the patient. The patient was often picking up bits and pieces, often keeping it secret from his modern physician, the fact that he is going for yoga treatment or Ayurveda treatment. But there are lots of very live examples of this kind. In fact, there's an interesting quotation attributed to Mao Zedong of 30s or 40s, which talks about walking on two legs, industry and agriculture, modern and traditional. So actually, in many cases, we find that people are doing experiments which are described as equivalent to kind of seeing with two eyes, rather than walking on two legs. Okay, I am not going to dwell too much on this, I will go to the last section. Now, this is one other interesting thing we see is that very often if you try to even combine inputs from tradition and modernity, you may find that at a very practical level, there may be very deeply different perceptions or descriptions of how a problem is seen and defined. And one very dramatic example, I became aware of it more than 25 years back when my wife was pregnant and carrying our firstborn. There is this phenomenon which people describe as morning sickness. There is a kind of nausea, aversion to food, etc., that women feel, some women feel during the first trimester of pregnancy or early stages. And modernity has a particular way of understanding it, it may be this deficiency, it may be that, treating it and all that. And I was really amazed to see an entirely different way in which Ayurveda or traditional medicine has an understanding of this condition. One of the traditional terms for a pregnant woman is Dauhridi. Now, Hridaya in Sanskrit, Tamil and many Indian languages means the heart. Heart not in the sense of just the physiological organ that pumps the blood, but heart as being the seat of emotion. The word Dauhridi literally means she who has two seats of emotion. This is a very deep and fundamentally different understanding. Very often you find that there are women who are fond of something and during this morning sickness period they say, I can't stand the sight of that. Or sometimes they don't like something but they will take a bit of that. There are swinging, fluctuating moods, varieties of things like this. Ayurveda captures this with the understanding that she is a Dauhridi. She is one who has, the mother has a seat of emotion and she is nurturing within her a baby which is another seat of emotion. Now, this would just be a cute or quaint understanding, but for the fact that this has wonderful practical implications and possibilities. Following from this are advice and help and assistance that traditional medicine people, Ayurveda, can tell you about what to do about such conditions, how can you help, So, this is something very interesting that very often you have entirely different ways to even frame a problem and look at it, which are very challenging and interesting to comprehend. And the last few slides, I will just sum up about 5 minutes. Traditional knowledge worldwide and how I see it. So, if you look at in a global scene about traditional knowledge, one would say, first of all, we would say it covers varied areas, including health, agriculture, natural resource management and various other sectors. Oral traditions are still present but declining rapidly in the past couple of centuries in Latin America, Africa and Asia. What would you say of oral traditions of Europe? One way of looking at it is that in a certain sense it has been destroyed. In a certain other sense, some of that has got transformed to today's modernity in traditional knowledge. That has also happened. If you look at the modern orthopedics tradition in England, the person whose statue that they have put up in the Liverpool School of Orthopedics is Hugh Owen Thomas, who was a traditional bone setter of 2 centuries back. So there is a sense in which some of it is continuing. Now, what would I say is the uniqueness about the Indian situation? I would like to share that. The most important thing is there is a classical textual knowledge in varied areas of tradition such as health, agriculture, architecture. This is not the case in general in Africa or Latin America. This is the case very strongly in India and in China, to some extent also by other countries in Asia which have a strong cultural influence by India. Much of them share the classical traditions of India, parts of Asia like Nepal or Indonesia or Thailand or even Vietnam and all that. Most importantly, there is a living body of classical scholars in many areas such as traditional health, but in smaller numbers in other areas. And most importantly, I think centrally important to us is what is the world view underlying this tradition? What is the, cosmovision, if one may say so. And one can take the example of something like agriculture. The Indian difference, if you take agriculture, is if you say traditional agriculture in Europe or United States, you are talking about chemical agriculture. If you are talking about traditional agriculture in India, that really means non-chemical and organic sustainable farming. Considerations of sustainability and eco-friendliness in the West is often seen as an afterthought. You have so many centuries of industrial development that seems to be ravaging the land with acid rains and all that. So you say we have to have a greening of industry. Then you say we have a greening of agriculture. There is also a greening of economics people are talking about. No? There is a mainstream thing that is strongly pushing in the way of non-sustainable thing, then as a corrective, as an afterthought. Whereas I would claim that sustainability and eco-friendliness of Indian traditions is inherent in our knowledge systems. You can deeply see it in traditional agriculture. Now, I'd also like to conclude with a few thoughts on what I think traditional knowledge and technology is not. It is not an underdeveloped form of modern knowledge or technology. I am not trying to say that this is an underdeveloped thing and eventually we will get where exactly modern knowledge system has got. No, that's not something that we are saying. It's not a second-rate option that we should provide to those who cannot afford modern solutions. If it is our assessment that in specific sectors or areas, modernity really has the best solution, we should provide that. It's not a second-rate thing that people should make do till modernity trickles down to them. And it's not a stopgap arrangement that we put in place till we are ready and able to provide modern solutions. We have to see that there are very many areas that in a very live and vibrant way, traditional technology has a lot to offer and meaningful solutions. What traditional technology is it's arising from a specific viewpoint and line of thinking. There is a worldview in which it is embedded. That worldview has intrinsic aspects as to what is the relationship of human beings with each other, what's the relationship of human being with cattle, with natural resources and the world around. It has its own areas of strength where it can contribute handsomely. Solutions, there are lots of solutions that are time tested and locale specific. It is capable of providing powerful answers where modernity may have none. In some cases, it has no answers or it may have nothing that is readily usable immediately. That's also something about which we have to be very clear, I would say. This is not a one-stop solution to all our problems as I understand it. So I'll just conclude with this beautiful passage from tradition again. In the tradition of Sanskrit plays, there is a character called Sutradhar. Before the play starts, the Sutradhar will come and address the audience, take their permission to launch the play, a play by such and such a playwright and all that. So the opening passage of Kalidasa's Madhavikagnimitram has this beautiful passage where someone comes to take permission from the audience that there is this new playwright Kalidas and I take your permission to stage. Someone from the audience objects and says that when there are so many grand playwrights A, B, C, why do we need this new man? Why are we listening to this? And these are wonderful words that he has penned. Those who know Sanskrit can appreciate the beauty of this Purana Mityevana Sahasram. Not everything is to be accepted as good merely because it is old, nor is something to be rejected only because it is new. The wise make a decision after they examine the specific details, Santaha, Pariksha, and then it's the fools who may get carried away by its central labels and descriptions. So I think this is a very beautiful passage with which I'd like to conclude. So thank you for your patient hearing, and I am open to any questions. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me? So I have 3 questions here. The one is about which is not covered, this TKDL, Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. Is it, how far it is doing at ground level? Hope you'll be knowing that in your field experience. Some questions regarding what has happened, what you told. You told about this observatory, whether they had the real space observatory or it's just theoretical calculation. You didn't confirm what is it actually observatory, what is observatory? They are having it or not? The second thing is the fishermen, the person's tribal communities were able to use the new variety from Australia as fish poison. Were you able to research how they did that and how you actually find out these properties?
Okay, TKDL, Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, just a brief description for those who are not familiar. The CSIR started a program saying that as per modern concepts in terms of intellectual property rights, if you say that something is your intellectual property, you have to first show that it is novel. You have to show other things too, but this is something new that you are saying that is not already known. Now, in the case of a lot of traditional knowledge, it is there in text, it is there in various other ways, but some of it may suffer from this limitation that you may not be able to claim that it's already available in public domain or in some domain as knowledge. So the CSIR has started an effort to digitize and document a whole corpus of traditional knowledge they call as TKDL or Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. My response to that is, yeah, so far as that effort goes, that's good. We should indeed be doing that. There are just two things, At the level of epistemology or at the level of method of science, there are some fundamental questions that still need to be solved. For example, neem, a patent was filed by Grace, some of those companies saying that neem is used for this, that, fungicidal properties of neem. So some groups were filing an opposition to that patent saying that, look, there is prior knowledge of that. Vandana Shiva was involved in it. So she asked me, is there documentation that I can produce to show what is already known about the uses of neem? Here you come across an interesting theoretical or epistemological gap. If you are talking in terms of neem and its properties described in Ayurveda or Siddha texts, the terminology would not be psoriasis or dermatitis or fungal infection. It will be talking about Vatat something, Pittat something, or the Asti Dhatu is affected, etc. How do you bridge this epistemological gap? Nobody else is going to do this for us. It has to be an interdisciplinary effort that Indians have to undertake. That's something we need to undertake. The other thing is, yes, while I am quite happy that TKDL is taking place, the greater worry is really that what are we doing with all this wonderful traditional knowledge around? We are only protecting. In fact, there is a joke among some of the friends saying that in some of the Hindi movies, you have this dramatic scene that there is a treasure, a big chest full of diamonds and sapphires and everything, buried in a box. And in the final scene, when people dig and get close to that, there is a snake that comes and hisses. It will not approach anybody to come near the treasure. What does the snake do with it? Just sits on it, right? Nothing. So that's what we seem to be doing in that traditional knowledge. It's not a grand thing to do. You should do something more than that. That's the first part. Second part is you are asking, how did they really have all this knowledge about astronomy? Do we conclude? I don't know if there is any quote-unquote conclusion for that. You don't really need to go to miracles like of 19th century. Even all around today, people do wonderful things that we need to study, but we are not studied. It's there all around you. 10 years back, I had gone to my uncle's house, and from a neighboring grocery stop, there's a boy who came to deliver the groceries. And my nephews and nieces younger than me, they crowded him and said, okay, dikhao, batao. I was wondering what it is. So that guy said, okay, etc. He sat in front of them and he moved his ear, not using his hands, like a cow or an elephant can move its ear. He moved. There is a traditional vidya or an art form that's called as Gokarna Vidya or Gachakarna Vidya. People are trained in it and know that. As a modern trained physiologist, I have no explanation for that. There are miracles like that all around you, man. We don't have to go to 19th century. I have no answers for that. We need to dig for answers as well. Similar is the case even with what the Varli tribals did. I have seen, for example, sometimes people give a theoretical explanation about which you may be skeptical as a moderner, but then you may have to recheck your theory if you think that practically it works. In the Karjat tribal area in Raigad district of Maharashtra, there is an organization that I know well that worked on traditional medicine. The tortoise, whose flesh is eaten by the tribals, they save the neck portion of it, allow it to dry and keep it. I was wondering what are they doing with it. They said that it's used in some traditional medicine preparations, like what, I asked. They said like for the treatment of piles and fistula and all that. They make a churna or some preparation, apply it locally, and something changes in the muscle tone or so, it just retracts. They say, what does a tortoise do? That neck has that springy property that it can, by snap, it can withdraw. So that property resides in that. As a modern biochemist, I may say, bakwasa, yeah, what is it that resides in this? That may be, but they are practically using it. So it's up to me to figure out saying that what is it that they are saying. They may be, if they are using it, then it's up to me to find out what is the methodology of it and all that. There are some cases where we have some glimpses of that understanding. No, I have no answers for that. I am just posing. fascinating issues like this that are all around for us to explore. Sorry. Yeah, please.
Better country, I think. It has, the organic farming has much more implications going on towards improving the society, the overall health of the society, and also something like self-dependence. I mean, it's much more, rather than the interdependent society which we have, wherein there's so much of transport, so much of pollution, so much of, I mean, all these things are the reason for the cancers, which I believe. So
No, it's interesting. There are interesting efforts led by a Frenchman called Michel Danino, who is a devotee of Sri Aurobindo, who was settled in India for over 35-40 years. He has come up, he has taken the effort to assemble a set of modules on various aspects of Indian knowledge systems that can feed into the school curriculum. In fact, that's one of the things I wanted to mention also because of the interest of the university in this curriculum. Eventually, I would do that. NCERT has started introducing and has some of those modules already. There are efforts, but every now and then it also leads to confusing situations because there is also a tendency of some people to claim that our ancients knew everything, they solved every single problem, and that's the only way to do anything. So we have to also carefully keep on distinguishing about what are the claims that we are making on behalf of traditional knowledge. Who is making these claims? Sometimes it's a very tricky thing. I have close friends who are extremely unhappy that I am talking on a subject like Indian knowledge systems. I got a stinker from one of my friends saying, next thing this will degenerate to Madrasi knowledge system and then Brahmin knowledge system. No, he sent me a stinker like that. So we have to keep on telling people what we mean and then also what we do not mean by Indian knowledge system. Yeah, okay. It's great that people like you are making an effort like that, because somehow it seems that it does carry a lot of conviction if it comes from people who are in an empowered situation, either in institutions or through modern knowledge. That's nice thing. But there are efforts like that which are heartening, it seems.
There is a message on Facebook. It usually says that Lord Macaulay wanted Indian education system to be destroyed first before conquering India. I mean, we have been conquered with the Western knowledge all through these years. Maybe we should revive it, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
So I have two questions. I may be overstepping on his question, but specifically I wanted to ask is, I think many of us believe that one of the reasons why the traditional science knowledge has not come into the mainstream education is because at one point we started teaching in English. I mean, the education system shifted to English as opposed to traditional or science through the mother tongues, for example, in Marathi or in Bengali. So for us to bring this into mainstream, is it necessary that at some point we have to take efforts to make science and of course all other subjects also in Indian languages? This is my first question. My second question is, science is of course a process. It's not a body of knowledge. So just like research has been going on in modern science nowadays, is research being going on in traditional science? And so I mean, I don't know, but assuming that it is not, wouldn't it be a great thing to kind of go ahead and do research in Ayurveda, for example? Because, for example, Ayurveda would have been developed in the ages where there were only native trees and herbs and shrubs. But now that we have imported trees, maybe we could come up with much more optimized solutions using Ayurveda in the modern scenario.
Two things. First is, actually if you look at the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia and how it has evolved through the centuries or millennia, potato does not exist till a few centuries back. Tobacco did not exist till more recently. If you look at the Nigantus, you find that periodically people are including through the centuries some of the newer materials that are coming in and talking about their properties in Ayurvedic terms. Even today, there is expertise available. For example, there is a brilliant Ayurvedic physician, Vaidya Ramesh Nanal in Pune, to whom we had this kind of discussion. Long time back, I wrote a monograph on Ayurvedic principles of food and nutrition. he contributed a chapter to it called Custard, Ek Ayurvedic Adhyayan. Custard is a modern thing. Can you analyze it from the point of view of Ayurveda and say what are the properties of it? What does it do to your Vata, Pitta or Kapha? What does it do to your Dhatus? What are the conditions for which it's indicated? What are the conditions for which it's contraindicated? I do believe it is live in the sense that you can throw modern questions at it. There are Ayurvedic physicians to whom I asked a question as to, long time back I was involved among other things in helping some people who are in the trade union movement in the unorganized sector. There are lots of employees who are in shifts. You are coming to me with Ayurvedic advice, you get up in Brahma Muhurtam, you sleep like this, you sleep like that. These guys are in night shifts. No? Do you have anything to tell them, Ayurvedic advice? Yes, indeed. I found that he can give very useful and solid advice. Advice cannot be you leave your job and find a different job. No? That may not be a choice for many people, but within that constraints, what can you do? But the question is, have we empowered Ayurveda and Ayurvedic institutions sufficiently? When I got out of high school, forgive me for saying that, I was considered a smart kid. People said I should study modern medicine, I should go to IIT, I should go to IAS. Nobody thought that I should study Ayurveda. No? I didn't think, and nobody whom I came into contact with ever thought or suggested. So for quite a while, we have not nurtured these institutions, we have not empowered these institutions. It's amazing that there is still so much vitality left in them because they are inherent vitality. I do believe that there is a lot of potential and strength that is untapped. The second part about whether it is linked to, education in one's own languages, yeah, I do believe that there may be, I think this is an institution that talks or addresses primarily issues of education. There are people who have much more depth and knowledge on this than me, I am sure. There is that aspect to it, but there is also the fact that traditionally Indians have been very easily multilingual and had a strong capacity to pick up various other languages. But I guess education at some crucial stages must take place in such a way that you don't get totally alienated from it. Once you have firm foundations in your own language and your own way of thinking, then you may have the capacity to interact and pick up so many other things. So whether that is necessarily the cause of this, I don't know, but definitely regarding the content of education, I am sure that if you are reading in all your textbook from 1st standard to 12th standard that something was invented by the Greeks, something by Macaulay, something by Romans, something else by Americans, there is no mention of any Indian having done anything worthwhile. You can't get out of high school with an idea that we are going to do great things in the coming century. No? Surely that has to change. What part language plays in it is something that still needs to be, I don't know if I have to. Yes, sir.
Seminars on this topic, but I'm trying to understand one particular element of what you mentioned in terms of the scientific method.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm wrong, but first I think you said that in the Indian tradition there are two different, almost separate sub-traditions. One you called the traditional knowledge-based, if I may put it crudely, Brahminical kind of a broad theory, all-encompassing broad theory of philosophy, knowledge, and then you mentioned that that's not all. There is a traditional practice that goes on that's much more empirical. So broadly speaking, I take it from there that there is one part that is theoretical kind of knowledge and everything is fitted into it, and another tradition that is going on separately, which is basically experimental and people are learning and so on and so forth and doing it, and the link between the two may not be very strong. So that's one kind of thing for clarification. The second point that I wanted to make was in terms of language and communication and the way in which science seems to develop. Basically, I think in science, there is like a colonialism. There are certain dominant trends that take hold and dominate other things. For example, even in Western science, I think physical science, etc., has dominated certain other kinds of sciences that are more synthetic and which put knowledge together. For example, study of insects, many of the biological knowledge, etc., all classificatory kind of knowledge. That knowledge is not in the mainstream of physics and etc. So therefore, the kind of thing that you described, for example, learning about qualities of certain things, the bitterness, non-bitterness, these are all it seems to me, sharp, very high forms of classificatory knowledge. You're basically not penetrating, you're not using a kind of a typical analytical method to go deep into it. And perhaps in the Indian system, we have a very strong kind of a classificatory mode, and even in the Western system, classificatory knowledge is probably not prioritized. And so therefore, we are really going in a different kind of track altogether. So that's the other thing. The other final point, of course, is that in our own system of knowledge, there is different language. I mean, for example, Ramanujam, the mathematician, everybody knows that he never gave any proof. He thought that if he could convince himself that a reality stuck to him as correct, he could just write down the theorem and mail it to Hardy. And that's it. And so therefore, we do not have a system. I mean, for example, proof. An Indian system of proof and the so-called battles that have been won by Shankaracharya and others in different debates, what is the method? So there is a different logical methodology, but which is different from the proof-oriented, empirical proof-oriented methodology. So I'm saying there are certain kind of differences in tradition and styles of thinking that seem to be part of the problem in what you seem to describe. I'm sorry, it's a little incoherent, but I thought I'll make these observations based upon.
No, these are very important about this, the folk tradition and the classical tradition, are they different, interlinked, what it is. I'm sorry if that didn't come across. The central point I'm trying to make is the folk tradition and the classical tradition are really richly interlinked. They talk the same technical terminology of the Panchamahabhut Siddhant, Tridosh Vichar. They are symbiotic in the sense that the classical tradition talks with great approval about the knowledge that is held by the folk, and the theoretical edifice of even Mahabhashyam talks about where is the ultimate testing, validation or proof of your grammar. It comes from Vyavahara, what is taking place in the marketplace or in the streets. And I don't think it's the correct knowledge. For example, you also said in between that this is held by the Brahmins. The leading Vaidyas of Kerala, the Ashtavaidyas, so many other these Vaidyas and the Varyas, for example, they are not necessarily the Brahmins. It is not a correct understanding that the foremost theoreticians or people who had this knowledge are necessarily the Brahmins. That's not the reality that we see. The second aspect you are saying is that is this knowledge classificatory or is this knowledge more theoretical and analytical, etc. There is a danger to having terminologies that are derived from one particular knowledge system and imposing it or seeing another knowledge system through its lens. When you use a term like analytical and so on, you may feel that that term is above and beyond the specificities of knowledge systems. But what if I were to say, challenge or prove that this analytical term that you are talking about is part of the same Greco-Roman tradition. It's not even part of the other tradition. And the problem is also you are saying there are 2-3 things. Take for example something like the utility and the theory. There is, for example, sometime back I had an interesting discussion on Archimedes' principle. Was it known to the ancient Indians? You all know, or if you are with diverse background, it talks about floating bodies. What is it that makes something float or sink? It has to do with design, etc. The answer may be that Archimedes' principle was not known to ancient Indians. But I go to Indonesia 15 years back, rich cultural influence from Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, etc. Why? It's an archipelago of 2,400 islands. The marine navigation between all the islands has been almost completely under the control of Indians, particularly the Tamils and the Chinese there. The Indians are a great seafaring people. So were the Chinese, who didn't know this Archimedes principle. They were constructing boats and ships that had displacements ranging to at least hundreds of tons, if not thousands, and circumnavigating the globe. That is what Cheng Ho did. So, are we going to hold them guilty and say that aapko Archimedes principle nahi pata hai? Or you say that they have a way of comprehending hydrology, they have a way of addressing hydrological principle, comprehending it. What it is, we don't know. We have to get into that, But they did all these things with the technology. Now, the other part is you were just, sorry, I lost track of one other third thing which you said in terms of this divide between this, and then you were saying whether yeah, concept of proof, I'm sorry. Now here again this is very interesting. In terms of concept of proof, people have not really looked deep enough in Indian literature and tried to comprehend what the concept of proof is. In a more limited sense, what they have tried to do is, do you have proof in the sense that the ancient Greeks or the Greco-Romans talked about? Now, if you look at the texts of ancient Indian mathematics and astronomy, in fact, interestingly enough, edited by Dr. M.D. Srinivas, there are recent texts that really addresses the concept of upapatti and proofs in ancient Indian mathematics and astronomy. If you look at that, you find that ancient Greeks had various types of proof that they talked about. The ancient Indians did not or will not accept the type of proof that in ancient geometry you called as reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum is accepted as a method of proof, whereas ancient Indians specifically discourse on that and say we don't accept that as a concept of proof. This is again an example of our not having sufficiently looked at depth to see basically what is this proof, what is the convincing way in which I gather knowledge, do a testing and validation of knowledge and communicate that knowledge. If I really say that I have some knowledge about these properties of water, in what way have I validated it so that I can say that I can generally share this as being? Basically that's what proof is about. You have an enormous corpus of knowledge that we have gained about so many of these substances that are proving themselves repeatedly. Just to give you an idea of this corpus, now we have an enormous wealth of knowledge about thousands of medicinal plants talking about its therapeutic properties, nutritional properties, not just about each plant. If you take about neem, there are texts talking about what is the property of the root, what is the property of the bark, what's the property of the neem oil, what's the property of the neem seed. It goes so far as to say that what is the property of the ripe leaf and the tender leaf. If it is for home remedy, in Tamil we say vepan thulir or vepan kozhundai for something, the tender leaf and neem leaf. There is a wealth of knowledge about it. We are talking about TKDL and protection because enormous amount of scientific research in its own way showing that it has utility, it is getting proven. We need to reflect on what are those categories that people use. If we are contemptuously dismissing, saying that how can something be Ushna or Shita, hot and cold, how can you make a theory with category like taste or proof, then you may feel that it's not proved, but we need to probe a bit deeper. I would really submit very humbly that yes, indeed, if you are posing it at a level of how did people test and validate knowledge, how did they communicate knowledge, there is enormous corpus of information and theory of it. There are also some modern attempts to render it to the modern trained and thinking, like this text of Upapatti. Each one of these, as you say, could be a subject for an entire seminar, but okay, we have made a beginning. Thanks, a very provoking question, Viren. Yes.
So
I
would
have
like to ask one traditional ways of natural resource management.
Yeah.
Would you like to focus, or would you like to throw light on a few of the methods which are used, which were used for the water conservation or the water storage methods, which are relevant today? Because as each passing day, each passing day, we are facing ecological challenges with the greater intensity. So those are maybe relevant in today's context also.
Actually, if you look at traditional methods of water storage and management, I am from Tamil Nadu, but we are now in Karnataka. Both Tamil Nadu and Karnataka have an extremely rich tradition of area or the tank system of irrigation, which is still very extensive, but in a rather rundown kind of manner. In fact, Arthur Cotton, who was a British engineer who worked in these areas, has looked at a landscape of tanks. Tanks are traditional methods for water harvesting or ARI. And many of them in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka are system tanks. That is, from the catchment area, the water drains into a particular irrigation tank or area as we call it. And they are designed in such a way that once this area is full, the overflow goes to a second area that is downstream and so on. They are connected up so beautifully. Arthur Cotton, who looked at the layout of these tanks in some parts of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, says that, look, the system is so perfectly designed, I don't think I can spot a single location where, according to my engineering skill, they could have constructed a tank and they missed out. I can't also spot a single location where I think that they put a tank in a wrong place, But what has happened to it in modern times, is something which is a different story. First of all, we have had more than a century of development where a whole lot of construction, laying of roads, drainage, everything has taken place without paying attention to this network and what are the things that you should conserve. Records of the pre-British time tells us that in villages in Chengalpet, 1% of the revenue of village was dedicated just to maintaining the water bodies. That is completely gone during the British and also the post-British period. There are also some engineering aspects of it that are really marvelous that we need to reflect on. Almost every modern dam, we say it's got silted up in so many decades, silted up in so many years, its capacity is gone. Have you ever thought about why is it that there are some very ancient tanks like Kallanai or even a tank near Mehrauli in New Delhi which are operational for 1,000 or more years? Dr. J.P.S. Oberoi, who is a famous scientist, posed this question to an IIT scientist, and coming out of that was a brilliant PhD thesis that looked about traditional Indian tank design. There are lots of things like this one can talk about, tank irrigation system itself. Sorry, that will open, yeah, please let.
We were talking about, as you said, rightly pointed out that, after the 10th standard, when the student is out, he wouldn't look into something like research in Indian way of, probably because we don't have it in our textbooks. And even now, when we teach trigonometry, it pains when we say it is a Greek word, tri and metry and all. I mean, all that, it pains. When actually we can trace it down to our Indian scriptures, it is trikona miti. So it is that way. Or when it comes to saying that earth is round was proposed by Pythagoras or Plato in way back in 6th century BC or 3rd century BC. But when we see our own Indian mythology, Varahavatara, when earth was rescued, we see the mother earth as, she has a spherical shape. So all these probably, if we were just to introduce a small bit of it just before the topic begins in our textbooks, would that help the children to, our future researchers to go into some field like this? Would that actually be of a great help?
I think we should introduce, but what we introduce, we should also subject it to very critical, rigorous examination. I would agree that there are substantial Indian contributions in calculus. People now know, in fact, if you go to the Google search engine and key in the words Newton or what's the other person? There are two people who are competing claims for who is the father of calculus, who is the other Frenchman, sorry, the name Newton or Leibniz. No, you type in the words neither Newton nor Leibniz. There is a course that has been on in some universities saying that the people who originated calculus was neither Newton nor Leibniz, but Madhava and a group of mathematicians, the Kerala School of Mathematicians. Some of those there is very solid evidence that we can back on. Whether we can say on the basis of Varahavadara that people had knowledge that the earth is round, I am not convinced. I would like to see more proof, or I'd like to see it. It may be that there are other things, but not just on the basis of that. So I think that we should indeed teach our children, but it has to be authenticated by some way. If we say we have serious questions and issues with Western scholarship, that doesn't mean we don't believe in any scholarship at all. We should have our own scholarship with rigorous standards. We should put it through a rigorous search before we teach our children. I would say that. Yeah.
First of all, apology for not sitting throughout your talk and going out in between. I have just two small quotations coming from the first decade of last century. The first quotation is from the Board of Agriculture in India meeting. And I would like to quote, it's an opinion by someone called J.B. Knight, who is talking about Pune Agriculture Experimental Farm. And these are his words. Quote, scientific breeding is almost unknown in the case of Indian cattle. In the breeding of these several breeds at Pune, it is proposed to demonstrate the value of scientific principles of breeding dairy cattle. It is believed that in the few generations, Indian dairy cow or buffalo could become so improved that she will compare favorably with the European dairy animal, unquote. The second quotation that I would bring in is from someone called Issa Tweed. And from a book that was published in 1911, and in 1911, in the preface of that book, that was already the third edition of the book, she has these words, and I quote, "I have often thought if more European and well-to-do native families in India were to keep cows, there would be less disease and less annoyance about procuring pure milk, butter, and ghee. And there would also be a great improvement in the breed of cattle. I am convinced that a very few persons in India know how to properly care for cattle when in health or treat them when sick. Most people trust the care of their cattle entirely to their servants and believe every word the stupid and dishonest Gowala says. There are a number of good veterinary surgeons and gentlemen practicing medicine in every town, and it would be more economical in the end to consult the best of them than to trust the stupid native servants," unquote. These are two quotations that I bring in from the first decade of last century. And it should throw some light about how, during colonial time, the entire apparatus of scientific animal husbandry or scientific agricultural practices went on. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, very briefly, I would just say that it seems to be a viewpoint that develops, inculcates, reflects a great deal of contempt for traditional knowledge of a particular kind. Of course, it's also true that traditional knowledge that is in a highly constrained situation, in a very distressed situation, may also be in a rundown way. There might have been local situation where it is. But in terms of breeds of cattle, we have some of the world's most wonderful breeds. It's a very different thing that in post-independence India, the policy for cattle breeds has been in a very different direction, so that the native breeds have been very poorly, the indigenous breeds of cattle. Nothing more than that, fine. I don't have anything more specific to say.
Should I? This question might be completely irrelevant. Going through the books and through history, I'm a fan of History TV, and there is this program called as Ancient Aliens. And I was very much amazed when I watched this channel, and they always say that the Germans always invested a lot on Sanskrit readings, and they have built their all space programs during the World War based on our writings. And also one of the scientists who migrated to America, he was ardent fan of Sanskrit, and he contributed to the race between US and USSR. My question here is that like Sir Sen said before, like Ramanujan, he did the all proofs, wrote theorems without any proofs. So how did this kind of future, what you can say, like modern thinking came into our traditions? Was there any alien influence?
Some of the questions that have come up indicate something which, I'll put it as an observation, and I'm sure you know the gravity of the observation, so it's not that I'm pointing out anything missing, but these observations are important. See, the problem really is how we locate ourselves in this kind of a discourse. Assuming that modern science originates from the Greco-Roman tradition is one kind of location. The other kind of location is, that eventually leads us to, several such things like, Ramayana and Mahabharata are not fiction, or, Germans learnt everything from us, etc. So it's really the location that is important. So for instance, whenever there is a discourse on traditional Indian sciences, why is it that we talk very little about the overlap with Unani or Tibetan or Chinese medicine? Now that actually defines a location. When you talked about Shastriya Parampara, there was a picture there. Now that picture actually defines our location. How are we talking about Shastriya Parampara? There is a particular religious tradition in which we are locating ourselves. I think that is much more of a fundamental problem. No sensible person today would say, no sensible person who is seriously considering scientific epistemology would say that, no, everything that has come to us from West is the only supreme thing. All that a modern scientist would like to say is that there is science, what we call science today, is something we have gotten from the West. There is something else which is traditional science or traditional knowledge. Let us not mix it. Let us not say that Vedas and Quran have science that we learn as science today, the modern science. So there is a difference. One is actually locating oneself to claim a superiority. So that is going on in the discourse from both ends. So I will point out many things. For instance, you talked about Panini. Now it was very nice, very wonderful that you said that, look, Sanskrit means refined. But if you talk to linguists, they will say Sanskrit is the mother of North Indian languages at least, okay? Now, they will say, look, prototype Prakrit or Proto-Sanskrit, no, those things are different. Sanskrit was a language spoken by certain people. What you are saying is that, no, it is a language which is engineered, which is refined. So in other words, Sanskrit becomes a daughter of Indian languages rather than the mother of Indian languages. So there is a very serious question of how we are locating ourselves. When we locate ourselves in a particular religious tradition, there is a conflict. And I mean, it's a serious conflict. What is Indian? I mean, is something that was being developed in Iraq in pre-medieval times, and of course the European science has learned a lot from there. Is that Indian or not? Or is it Indian only what, even if the Vaidyas of Kerala were not Brahmins, but certainly there is an exclusivity. There is an exclusive nature that we find in this kind of a discourse. I mean, there are Gupta Sharmas in Bengali Brahmins who were Gupta Sharmas because they were surgeons and they had to have secret meetings because they were touching dead bodies. That is also part of our tradition. So while indulging in this discourse, we often do not point out these essential features that distinguish our tradition. I will also mention certain other things. For instance, when you talked about rationalization of units, now today in afterthought, in fact, most of what we know about our texts are actually much later editions. As you have mentioned yourself, a lot of things have been modified, so we really do not know how authentic the original texts are. I mean, there have been so many later editions. So rationalization of units, today you can do that. Now units for, when you talk about Anjali for urine or Anguli for a particular individual, it is not only for that purpose that the unit is used. The unit is also used for measuring land. You see, so you don't rationalize land to an individual's body measures, right? So Dirgha or whatever units were there, they're not just rationalized to an individual. So today to say as a, as an afterthought that, look, this is how these units were invented, I think again it is indulging in a certain kind of location, So that's one thing. And then you mentioned something about science, which is at best partially correct. You said modern science needs continuous revision. It needs continuous revision subject to newer findings by inductive methods. It doesn't need continuous revision per se. To say that modern science needs continuous revision is a very simplistic reading of modern science. Just because a theory is there and we need to change it because it is modern science, that is not what modern science is. I'm sure you would agree to that. Only when you have newer findings that question the interpretations given by older theories, then there are structural revolutions, in the Kuhnian way of thinking, then there is a paradigm shift, all this is well understood. So I'm saying that somehow we are constrained when we engage in this discourse to locate ourselves in certain traditions, to establish a superiority of certain kind of Indianness, which anyway wasn't there in many of our minds. It is highly questionable to define Indianness as a unique identity. And then of course we start inventing, for instance, for trigonometry, trigonometry. So we go on through this process of inventing that these things were there and this was there, etc., which actually are, as you know, there are no basis for that. So that's about all I wanted to say.
For illuminating talk, because it's well known to all of us that the Indian richness of the scripture as well as knowledge system which we're talking about. But my question is revolving around what exactly is the applied area in the 21st century. When we talk about so many traditional medicine system and we were knowing about large number of plants as medicinal plant, why it is so that haldi, neem, basmati, these are all coming through from US and talking about the FDA approval. Means foreign, when we talk about the US approval is the hallmark for any of the entities in the world. Why not we can have, as a pioneer in the Ayurvedic system in medicine, that we should set our own quality standard to make a benchmark that this is Indian system, so this is the best in the world. That is because not only from the richness of the scriptures, but on the applied area. This is my first question. Second is this, we have to learn from China. Again and again that comes in discourse that Chinese system of medicine, for example, a very simple thing, a balm, which is almost globally and just household medicine. Why do we go for the Chinese balm when we know that Chinese system of medicine, as well as we know that even from the other part of the world we are in, like vegetarian system of medicine, they might be having so many animal parts, as you mentioned about the tortoise and all, that what they have did in the economics in the world, that those system of medicine prevailed and accepted all over the world. That's it.
Just a few general, yeah. There were a number of strands, some of which were questions, some of which were observations. First, he started with this German interest and all that. Yes, and it is true that there have been a lot of German scholars who have been interested in Sanskrit texts, manuscripts of various kinds. To the best of my knowledge, I heard this people say here and there. I found nothing to substantiate this view that either in the development of spacecrafts or in atomic weapons, there is some kind of lead or knowledge that they had from traditional Indian manuscripts or texts. I heard people voice this rather loosely, and personally I have not found any evidence in favor of this at all. In fact, one of the classic ways in which you can weaken your case is by overstating it, they say. You make all kinds of claims about it, then you weaken the case. In my opinion, we have to be quite clear as to what are the basis on which you are saying, what are the claims that you are making. I heard people say that, and I heard people say things like, there is a station master who cures snake bites. What does he do? You don't even have to go to him. If you give a telegram to him, bus, your snake bite will get cured. For decades, I have asked people, please tell me where that station master is. I want to meet, interview, give telegram, nothing. I have not yet found any such thing. Lots of stories like this that we have a proverb in Tamil. Kannal kandadum poi, kadal ketadum poi, thira visaripede me. Whatever you see with your eyes may not be valid. Whatever you hear with your ears may not be valid. The only thing that you can take as valid and correct is what you have determined as the result of thorough investigation. So personally, I heard people say this, but if there is proof for it, I have not encountered that. That's what I'd say. He had made several remarks in terms of locating this discourse and all that. I had just heard. There are lots of differences also I have. For example, in terms of science, my statement was not that science has to keep changing. The general characteristic of, if you just say, what is it that people identify with as a vibrant scientific system, they seem to think that theories or categories is something that's continuously revised, accumulating changes, of course in response to newer knowledge and all that. Once I was witness to a very interesting conversation between a very famous Indian scientist who was a member of the Academy of Science, Prime Minister's Advisory Council, etc., and a leading Ayurvedic physician. I was caught in between them as a bit of translation. So as a charge, this scientist just said, he was very curious and open, saying that what is this? Theories of Ayurveda seem to be frozen and unchanging. Are there not newer things and all that? This man very powerfully made a discourse saying, "Hamare shastra ke siddhant shashwat hain." This is the term that he used. Shashwat means timeless in a sense. But then he is talking about categories of a different kind that came out in detailed discourse. So it's not that it's necessarily a characteristic of science to change, but quite often when people look at traditional bodies of knowledge, one of the cobwebs they have, charges they have is that you're talking about this, but has it not undergone rapid revisions and changes in this committee that the government of Madras Presidency appointed to try to comprehend the scientific basis of Indian medicine? One of the repeated things is that this got fossilized at some point and didn't develop after that. Some people said it got fossilized due to Brahmins, someone else said that during Buddha's period, someone else said that something else, etc. But the basis of it is that it's not evolving or changing. That's what. There are so many other things, some of which I entirely agree with you, some of which we differ. I am really very hesitant in terms of a general glorification of saying that everything comes from the tradition, everything is contained in the tradition. There is a restricted way in which people use it technically, but I am not generally in agreement with tracing all glory or all ills to our tradition. The other thing I was saying about China, it is true, apart from generalization, it's true that in a very substantial way, they have tried to make, address and make use of indigenous knowledge for today's context in a very substantial way. You can look at it in specific areas. For example, in areas like treatment for burns or even wound healing and all that, they have brilliantly combined inputs from modern and traditional medicine. They have developed something in which they can say that, they really made an excellent combination of some of those things. In terms of why is it that we have to wait for certificate from elsewhere, that's a question that we have to ask ourselves. We also have to ask ourselves, why is it if we are having all this knowledge, that continuously we have been putting only not more than 3 or 4% of the national health budget for traditional systems of medicine. Those are also organized systems like Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, Yoga, Naturopathy, nothing for folk medicine. Why is it that we continuously invest 96% of our health resources only to modern medicine? Why not much more resources you put at it, pose questions, make it answerable? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves also collectively, nothing more. So I think I'll conclude here, Giri, and I am available if people still want to have a chat. Thanks for all this enthusiasm. Thanks. Okay. Thanks.
To Balu on behalf of all of us. And I must say that this question answer session, normally in colloquiums, one has to say anybody else and anybody else. Here we had to in fact put a cap on it. So I guess the topic was such. Thank you once again, Balu, for sparing time today to come here and talk.
Thanks, Dylan.